Welcome to another thrilling Detective Agatha Marple mystery audiobook, Miss Marple's Most Chilling Case. If you're new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating detective stories full of mysteries, thrillers, and suspense. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. We're excited to have you here again. Let's dive into another unforgettable tale. Act 2, The Second Murder. St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on being an orderly sort of village, where the biggest scandal on most days involved an overgrown hedge encroaching onto a neighbour's property. But on this particular morning, order had been replaced by a nervous, whispering unease. Miss Marple had anticipated it, of course. A single murder, particularly one as puzzling as Peter Abbott's, might be attributed to any number of things: ill fate, misadventure, even the sort of rare but not unheard of village feud. But two meant something altogether different. She heard the news before she saw the scene. It was the kind of morning when mist still clung stubbornly to the hedgerows, reluctant to surrender to the weak November sun. The small knot of villagers gathered outside the modest cottage of Iris Henderson was hushed, their voices carrying the strained urgency of people attempting not to gossip but failing spectacularly. Miss Marple, wrapped in a sensible grey coat, approached with measured steps, nodding to those who greeted her with wide eyes and murmured speculation. The details filtered through to her in snippets. Found her early this morning, just sitting there, like she meant to be discovered. The police say it's the same sort of thing as before, some symbol left behind. Doesn't make sense, poor woman. Why Iris? Miss Marple had met Iris Henderson many times, a widow of 10 years, comfortably off but unremarkable, apart from a fondness for gossip that even Miss Marple found occasionally excessive. There had been nothing about her that suggested an untimely end, but then again, neither had there been anything about Peter Abbott. She found Henry Graves, the constable, standing stiffly near the doorway, his expression one of mild distress. He had never cared much for investigating crime. Miss Marple, he acknowledged, in a resigned sort of way. She gave him a sympathetic look. "A trying morning, Henry?" "You might say that," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "I suppose you'll want to have a look." She did not bother answering. Inside the cottage, the parlour was tidy, arranged with the kind of care that suggested someone had been expecting company. A tea tray sat untouched on the low table, the remnants of a single uneaten scone resting neatly on a china plate. And there, in her favourite chair by the fireplace, sat Iris Henderson, or what remained of her. Miss Marple took it in with her usual quiet assessment. The woman was still dressed in a well-kept, if somewhat old-fashioned navy blue dress, her hands resting lightly in her lap as if she had merely dozed off. But there was no mistaking the unnatural stillness, the unnatural quiet. And then there was the flower, a single white lily laid delicately across her lap. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. A playing card at one murder scene, a white lily at another. A pattern was forming. "Poison," said Henry Graves somewhere behind her. He sounded deeply put out by it. Same as with Abbott. No sign of struggle, no wounds, just sat down for tea and never got up again. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the room, noting the details. The carefully arranged curtains, the way the sugar bowl had been left with its lid slightly askew, the faint scent of lavender soap still lingering in the air. She moved toward the bookshelf, her fingers brushing lightly over the titles until she found what she was looking for. A small volume, barely noticeable, a collection of old nursery rhymes. She opened it carefully. A pressed white lily had been tucked inside, fragile with age. Miss Marple pursed her lips. A stolen tart, a weeping queen, a fleeing knave, and now a flower. The sort one lays at a grave. She turned back to the room. Henry was watching her with the long-suffering patience of a man who knew he was already several steps behind. "You have that look about you, Miss Marple," he said warily, "the one that means you've already got it half worked out." Miss Marple gave him a small, non-committal smile. "Not entirely worked out, Henry, but I do believe I am beginning to see the rhythm of things." And outside, beyond the walls of the small cottage, the village continued to hum with life, unaware that death had not yet finished its work. The Bantry's drawing-room was a place of old comfort, worn but well-kept furniture, the scent of lemon polish lingering in the air, and the ever-present feeling that too many conversations had been conducted in hushed tones beneath its high-beamed ceiling. It was the sort of room in which the past lingered, where the weight of old family portraits and heavy drapes made one feel that secrets had been exchanged here for generations. This afternoon the air was thick with something else, a collective unease. Dolly Bantry poured tea with the same determined air she always did, as though ensuring everyone had a full cup might somehow set the world right. Her husband, Colonel Bantry, stood near the hearth, arms crossed, the posture of a man who much preferred battles with clear enemies rather than the nebulous threat of a murderer moving unseen among them. Seated in various armchairs and sofas were a few other notable villagers. Dr. Ellsworth, the local physician, whose expression was grim, Reverend Milton, mild-mannered but visibly troubled, and, of course, Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting in hand, her bright eyes scanning the room with quiet amusement, as if merely an observer to the moment rather than the architect of it. "Well," Dolly said, settling into her seat, "we can't very well go on like this, can we? 2 deaths in a fortnight, and people are starting to eye their neighbours like foxes in a hen-house." Colonel Bantry grunted. "Can you blame them? First Abbott, now Iris Henderson. If there's a pattern to this, we had best find it before the blasted constable does something useless. Like setting a curfew?" Dr. Ellsworth stirred his tea but did not drink it. "There is a pattern," he said. "The method? Poison. No sign of struggle. And then there's the theatrics." He glanced at Miss Marple. "First a playing card, now a flower. That sort of thing doesn't happen without meaning something." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, setting her knitting needles down. "The difficulty, of course, is understanding what it means before we have a third occurrence." A heavy silence followed. It was Reverend Milton who broke it. "I don't suppose it could be some kind of madman?" he asked hopefully. Miss Marple smiled kindly at him. "My dear Reverend, I very much doubt that. The trouble with madmen is that they are often terribly disorganized. They do not tend to favour such careful precision." Dolly Bantry leaned forward. "You've a theory, Jane. I can see it in that frightfully clever little face of yours." Miss Marple gave a slight shrug. "I have the beginnings of a notion, perhaps. A pattern is emerging, but I suspect it has been long in the making." Dr. Ellsworth frowned. "Long in the making?" Miss Marple's expression was mild, but her voice carried a note of certainty. "Revenge is a dish best served cold, Doctor, and our murderer, whoever they are, has been planning this for quite some time." Colonel Bantry let out a sigh. "Blast it all, do we know what links the victims yet?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "We do." All eyes turned to her. She smiled, just a little. "I do believe we are following a rather morbid nursery rhyme." Reverend Milton blinked. "A nursery rhyme?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. The playing card, the flower. They are not arbitrary. They correspond to an old rhyme, one that tells a tale of deception, theft, and punishment. Dolly gasped. "That wretched thing about the King of Hearts and his stolen tart?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Precisely." A silence settled over the room as the realization took shape. "But surely, Jane, that's just a children's rhyme." "But surely, Jane, that's just a children's rhyme?" Miss Marple gave him a shrewd look. "My dear Reverend, I have found that the simplest stories are often the ones people remember most, and people, particularly those with grievances, do so love a bit of poetic justice." Dr. Ellsworth shifted in his chair. "So the murderer is reenacting this rhyme?" Miss Marple nodded. "A stolen tart, a weeping queen, a fleeing knave, and now flower. The sort one places at a grave." She looked at the group meaningfully. "I believe we are watching a long-buried crime being repaid, step by careful step." Colonel Bantry exhaled sharply. "Then we need to stop this lunatic before they finish their game." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fire. "Yes," she murmured, "we do." And yet a nagging thought lingered in her mind. Who, in St. Mary Mead, had been waiting all these years to settle an old score, and how many more verses of the rhyme were yet to be played out? The fire crackled softly in Miss Marple's sitting-room, sending flickering shadows across the floral wallpaper. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead was settling into an uneasy night. Windows were shuttered earlier than usual, the familiar chatter of evening walkers conspicuously absent from the narrow lanes. Fear had crept into the fabric of daily life, and Miss Marple felt it as keenly as anyone. She sat in her armchair, a woolen shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting untouched on the small table beside her. The weight of the day lingered in the quiet space. The whispered theories over tea, the concerned murmurs at the grocer's, the furtive glances exchanged between villagers who were no longer entirely sure whom they could trust. 2 murders, Peter Abbott and Iris Henderson, both poisoned, both carefully staged with deliberate symbols left behind. A playing card and a white lily, and now a village steeped in unease, its people carrying the silent, unspoken question, who will be next? She had seen it before. How violence, once it took root in a place, had a way of seeping into every crack, every whispered conversation, every sidelong glance. St. Mary Mead had always been a village of secrets, of small grudges and long-held resentments, but this was something else. She sighed, rubbing her hands together lightly as she stared into the fire. There were moments, rare though they were, when she wondered if she should leave such matters to younger, more official minds. After all, she was just an elderly woman, a retired governess, a quiet spinster who should, by all accounts, have long since resigned herself to a peaceful, uneventful life. But that had never quite been her way. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that evil did not announce itself with a flourish. It did not always come in the form of a glaring, obvious villain. More often than not, it nestled comfortably into the most unsuspecting corners, behind the polite smiles of neighbours, in the carefully measured words of shopkeepers, in the familiar rhythm of village life where one rarely questioned what had always been. It was precisely because she was an old woman, because she was quiet and unassuming, that people tended to forget she was watching. And oh, how she watched! She reached for her notebook, flipping to a fresh page. The pattern! She wrote the words neatly, underlining them once. Below she listed the known facts. Peter Abbott, former schoolmaster. Poisoned, found with a playing card, the King of Hearts. Iris Henderson, widow, poisoned. a white lily placed in her lap, a playing card, a flower. Miss Marple tapped the end of her pencil against her chin. A pattern? She turned to a previous page where she had scrawled lines from the old nursery rhyme. The King of Hearts he made a tart, and so they stole it plain. The Queen she wept, the knave he fled, and ne'er was seen again. A stolen tart, a grieving queen, a vanishing knave. She had no doubt that this was the murderer's chosen template. The question was, who was playing which role? She exhaled, writing down a name beside Peter Abbott's. The King. A man whose past held quiet secrets. A family history linked to an old scandal. Had he been targeted for a crime long forgotten? And then Iris, the Queen, the weeping figure in the rhyme. But Iris had not been known for grief. Widowed for years, yes, but not a woman consumed by sorrow. If this was truly the pattern, then who, or what, was she meant to represent? Her gaze fell to the empty space below the names. The knave, the one who fled, Miss Marple frowned, was the next victim already chosen. The thought sent a chill through her, not from fear, but from urgency. This was not a case of random murders. This was a deliberate path, a story unfolding with careful precision. And if she was right, if the murderer was methodically reenacting the rhyme, then there would be another death. Unless she stopped them first, her fingers tightened around the pencil, and she leaned forward, sketching the first line of what she hoped would be the answer before it was too late. Somewhere in this village, someone was playing a game, and Miss Marple intended to end it before the final verse was sung. The village of St. Mary Mead, for all its genteel charm, was not accustomed to fear. It was a place where the postman knew everyone's business before they did, where the grocer's boy still tipped his cap to passing ladies, and where the most pressing concern on an ordinary day might be the precise etiquette of borrowing a neighbour's pruning shears. But this was no ordinary day. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, as she reread the hastily scrawled note that had been slipped under her door early that morning. "It isn't over. Watch the clock. The next will be soon." It was unsigned, of course, but the words had a quiet urgency that sent a shiver down her spine. Watch the clock. Miss Marple rarely ignored advice, especially when it was cryptic. She reached for her notebook, flipping through the pages where she had meticulously recorded every detail of the case. The deaths of Peter Abbott and Iris Henderson, the playing card, the white lily, the connections to the old nursery rhyme, and then she saw it. A simple fact she had noted days ago but had not yet considered in full. Both victims had died on anniversaries of events tied to an old village scandal. Peter Abbott's murder had fallen on the anniversary of Rupert Abbott's disgrace, the day he had been dismissed from the parish and vanished into obscurity. Iris Henderson's death had occurred on the anniversary of Sarah Pembroke's disappearance, the young woman whose ruin had been conveniently forgotten by those who preferred their pasts neatly swept under the rug. And now, if the pattern held, Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her pencil as she quickly scanned her notes. The next significant date was tonight. She exhaled sharply. That was what the note had meant. The killer was following a timeline. Miss Marple reached for her shawl, rising from her chair with uncharacteristic haste. She had spent the last week carefully untangling the past, but now the future was rushing toward her, and she would not, could not, let the murderer reach their next victim. The village clock tower, standing solemnly in the centre of St. Mary Mead, chimed once. The warning in the note echoed in her mind. Watch the clock. Time was running out. The air was damp with the scent of rain-soaked earth, and a thick mist curled around the hedgerows as 3 figures stood concealed in the shadows outside St. Mary Mead's old vicarage. The clock tower in the village square had just struck 11, each toll reverberating through the stillness like the slow, deliberate heartbeat of the night. Miss Marple, bundled in a practical woolen coat, stood with Colonel Bantry and Constable Graves, both men radiating varying degrees of scepticism. The colonel, accustomed to more traditional forms of conflict, had taken some convincing to participate in what he had muttered was a rather theatrical escapade. Graves, on the other hand, had agreed with his usual begrudging air, muttering about how he wasn't about to let some old woman stumble into a real murderer's hands. Miss Marple, for her part, had ignored both men's complaints with quiet amusement. "I don't know why we couldn't have done this from inside the pub," muttered Colonel Bantry, shifting uncomfortably in his heavy coat. "One can conduct an excellent stake-out with a brandy in hand." "Because, Arthur," Miss Marple whispered patiently, "the murder is not taking place inside the pub, and one really must be present to prevent it." Bantry harumphed, but said no more. Constable Graves checked his pocket-watch and exhaled slowly. "I still don't see what makes you so certain this is the next location, Miss Marple." She adjusted her gloves. "Because, Henry, we are following a pattern, and the murderer is quite fond of theatrics. The first 2 deaths were tied to their respective places of disgrace. The vicarage, you may recall, was where Rupert Abbott's life was undone." Graves scowled. "That was over 40 years ago." "Yes," she murmured, eyes scanning the empty street. "But old wounds do have a way of festering, don't they?" A hush settled over them once more, the stillness of the village stretching taut. Miss Marple stood perfectly composed, her keen eyes watching the vicarage door, the shuttered windows, the narrow garden gate. There was something almost too quiet about the scene, as though the village itself was holding its breath, and then a rustling noise. It was slight, barely more than a whisper against the cobbled path, but Miss Marple caught it at once. Colonel Bantry stiffened beside her. Graves, suddenly alert, motioned for silence as his hand went instinctively to his truncheon. Another sound. This time a creak, as though weight had shifted on an old wooden floorboard. It came from the vicarage. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Somewhere in the darkness a shadow moved. The 3 of them remained motionless, barely daring to breathe. Then a sudden, sharp clatter, as though something had been knocked over inside the house. Graves muttered a curse under his breath. "That's it. I'm going in." "No," Miss Marple said, sharply enough that both men hesitated. "Wait." Seconds passed. The night, previously so heavy with silence, had come alive with tension. A figure emerged. Just a flicker of movement against the darkness, a tall, slender silhouette, slipping through the side gate, moving with the careful precision of someone who did not wish to be seen. Miss Marple inhaled. The murderer had arrived, and she was ready. The moment the shadowed figure slipped through the vicarage gate, the tension in the air thickened like an oncoming storm. Constable Graves, never one to tolerate prolonged inaction, shifted his weight forward, ready to intervene. Miss Marple, however, was faster. Her hand, surprisingly firm for a woman of her age, closed around his arm. "Wait, Henry," she murmured. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were razor-sharp, fixed on the silhouette disappearing into the garden's depths. For a moment it seemed as though nothing would happen. The village held its breath. Then a sudden noise. A thud, followed by the crash of something heavy being knocked over. Bantry swore under his breath. "That's it. Before he could move, the vicarage side door burst open. A tall figure dashed out into the moonlight, their coat flaring behind them like a shadow in flight. Graves shouted, "Stop!" The figure did not stop. They ran. It was instinct rather than deliberation that propelled Miss Marple forward, her feet quick despite the damp cobblestones. She did not need to chase, she only needed to see. And as the fleeing figure disappeared down the lane, she did. A glimpse of something small fluttering to the ground in their wake, a single slip of paper, torn and caught in the breeze. Miss Marple reached it before the others, stooping to pluck it from the stones. A note, hastily written, the ink smudged as though in a hurry. She turned it over, and for the briefest moment her breath caught. The final line of the nursery rhyme, scribbled with deliberate intent, and ne'er was seen again. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the paper. Behind her, Bantry and Graves were still speaking, arguing about whether to give chase, about what to do next. But she did not hear them. Her mind had leapt ahead, faster than either of them could run. This was not just a reference, this was not just a clue. This was a warning. The final act in the pattern was about to play out, and if she did not stop it, someone in St. Mary Mead was about to disappear, forever. Miss Marple straightened, her expression unreadable, and turned toward the others. "We have no time to waste," she said crisply. "We must move. Now." The fire in the Bantry's drawing-room crackled softly, casting flickering light against the heavy drapes and polished mahogany furniture. The air, warm from the hearth yet cool with unease, carried the faint scent of lavender and pipe smoke. Remnants of a time when this room had hosted far more mundane affairs than the unveiling of a murderer. Miss Marple sat in her usual place, the picture of quiet composure. A delicate china teacup rested in her hands, though she had yet to take a sip. Around her, arranged in varying degrees of discomfort, sat the people of St. Mary Mead, those she had summoned with careful intent. The suspects. The atmosphere was as finely strung as a piano wire, ready to snap at the wrong note. Dolly Bantry, of course, presided over the gathering with a mix of excitement and anxiety, her sharp eyes darting about as though expecting the murderer to leap out at any moment. Beside her, Colonel Bantry wore an expression of long-suffering resignation, his stiff military posture betraying his impatience with the proceedings. In the opposite chair sat Dr. Ellsworth, the village physician, his thin fingers drumming against his knee. He had attended both victims, and though his expression was calm, there was a shadow in his eyes that spoke of questions left unasked. Beside him, Reverend Milton, mild and bespectacled, sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap. He had once presided over the vicarage where Rupert Abbott had fallen into disgrace, and though he had been but a young curate at the time, Miss Marple suspected his memory was sharper than he liked to admit. To his right, Edith Phelps, one of the village's oldest residents, was perched stiffly in her chair, her lips pursed as though she disapproved of the entire affair. "I failed to see why I was needed," she had muttered upon arrival, though Miss Marple had caught the flicker of curiosity behind her protest. And finally, Henry Graves, the local constable, sat nearest the door, arms folded, watching the room like a man caught between irritation and duty. Miss Marple let the silence settle, just long enough for discomfort to take root. Then, with a small smile, she set down her teacup and spoke. "You must forgive me for bringing you all here under such unusual circumstances," she began, her voice light yet measured. "But as I am sure you have all realized, we are not dealing with ordinary murders." A shifting in seats, a few darting glances. Miss Marple continued, "I have spent the past week attempting to untangle the threads of this crime, and as with all great mysteries, The key to solving it lies in the past. She allowed her gaze to sweep over them, reading the flickers of recognition, the tensing of shoulders. Peter Abbott, she said. Iris Henderson. Both victims carefully chosen, both left with symbolic objects, a playing card, a white lily. It is not the work of a madman, as some have suggested. It is a game, a performance, played according to a nursery rhyme. At this, Edith Phelps made a small, involuntary sound. Miss Marple turned her attention to her. You recall it, don't you, Miss Phelps? The rhyme about the King of Hearts? Edith hesitated. Then, with a sigh, she spoke. The King of Hearts, he made a tart, and so they stole it plain. The Queen she wept, the knave he fled, and ne'er was seen again. The words hung in the air. Miss Marple nodded. A seemingly innocent children's rhyme, yet, as I have come to realize, it is the foundation for these crimes. A stolen tart, a grieving queen, a fleeing knave. And now we are at the final act. Reverend Milton shifted uncomfortably. Are you saying the murderer is following this pattern deliberately? Miss Marple inclined her head. I am, and when one follows such a pattern, one must ask, who is playing what role? A silence. Dr. Ellsworth cleared his throat. But what does it mean? A rhyme is just a rhyme, Miss Marple. Not when it is a metaphor, Miss Marple countered. We must look to the past to understand it. She folded her hands in her lap. Rupert Abbott was disgraced, a scandal hushed up, a young woman ruined, a secret that was meant to be forgotten. Her gaze swept across the room. But someone did not forget. She let the words settle. Then slowly she continued, Peter Abbott, the King of Hearts, the heir to a tarnished name. He was the price to be paid for his father's misdeeds. Iris Henderson, the grieving queen. Not a queen in the literal sense, of course, but a woman left behind, bearing the weight of what had been stolen. Reverend Milton's face had gone pale. You don't mean... Miss Marple's eye sharpened. Oh, but I do. Sarah Pembroke, the woman whose life was destroyed by Rupert Abbott's betrayal. A chill passed through the room. She was sent away, Miss Marple continued. And yet we do not know what became of her. Edith Phelps stirred. There were rumours. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, and if she had a child... She let the suggestion linger. A child, born of scandal, raised in the shadow of a mother's grief, a child who had grown year by year, nursing an inherited wound, shaping their identity around an injustice never made right, a child who had returned to St. Mary Mead, intent on settling the score. Miss Marple placed her hands on the arms of her chair. And that brings us to the final line of the rhyme. The room held its breath. The knave he fled, and ne'er was seen again. A pause. Then, in a voice quiet yet firm, Miss Marple said, The final murder will not be an act of vengeance, but an act of escape. Dr. Ellsworth frowned. Escape? Miss Marple nodded. The murderer has been reenacting this rhyme step by step. If they are following the pattern precisely, then the last act is not a killing, it is a disappearance. The realization dawned slowly across the faces in the room, which means, she added, rising to her feet, we are not searching for a murderer preparing to strike again. We are searching for a murderer who is about to vanish. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. They had very little time left. The fire had burned low in the Van Priest's drawing-room, its embers glowing faintly in the hearth. The assembled group sat in tense silence, the weight of Miss Marple's words still lingering in the air. A murderer, poised to vanish. Miss Marple, ever composed, folded her hands neatly in her lap. "We are dealing," she began, her voice steady, "with a crime that was never meant to be solved. The murders were not merely acts of violence, but a carefully staged performance. Each step, each clue, was a calculated reference to a past injustice, one that has been meticulously avenged in the present." A pause. Then, with the precision of a weaver threading her final stitch, she laid out the pattern. "Peter Abbott," she said, "was the first. He represented the King of Hearts, the one who made a tart." She glanced at the faces around her, ensuring they followed. A tart, as you may recall, was stolen in the nursery rhyme, a metaphor, I believe, for something else. A betrayal. Dr. Ellsworth stirred. "You believe this refers to Rupert Abbott?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed. The Abbott family name has long been associated with the scandal of the missing church funds. But I believe the real theft was not money at all. The true tart that was stolen was Sarah Pembroke's future." Reverend Milton exhaled, his hands clasped tightly. Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. "Sarah Pembroke was ruined by Rupert Abbott, cast out in disgrace. The village, preferring to forget unpleasantness, let her name slip into obscurity. But someone did not forget." Dolly Bantry let out a small gasp. "The child." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely." She let the significance settle before pressing on. She said next, "Was the second victim a widow, a woman who lived in quiet solitude. She was killed on the anniversary of Sarah Pembroke's disappearance, and a white lily was left upon her lap." "A symbol of mourning," muttered Edith Phelps. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "A grieving queen." The second line of the rhyme. "The queen, she wept." A shiver ran through the room. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "But why? Iris Henderson, what did she have to do with all this?" Miss Marple's expression darkened slightly. "That, my dear Arthur, is where human nature comes into play. Iris Henderson was no innocent bystander. She was one of the few who knew the truth about Sarah Pembroke and kept silent. She lived with knowledge she never shared, and for that she too was marked." Dolly Bantry whispered, "And now we come to the last part of the rhyme." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, the knave he fled, and ne'er was seen again." A silence fell. It was Henry Graves who spoke first. "So the killer, whoever they are, is planning to disappear?" Miss Marple met his gaze. "Yes, and I believe they have planned it quite carefully." She reached into her handbag and retrieved the scrap of paper found during the stakeout. "This note," she said, holding it up, "was dropped by the very person we are looking for. They were at the vicarage last night, tying up loose ends before vanishing." She turned the paper over, reading the final line aloud. "And ne'er was seen again." A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple surveyed the faces before her, her expression calm yet watchful. "This is the final step in their plan. If we do not act swiftly, our murderer will slip away, just as the rhyme dictates." Dr. Ellsworth's face was pale. "But who is it, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "My dear doctor," she said, rising to her feet, "I believe I have known the answer for quite some time, and if we move quickly, I rather think we may prevent the final act from being completed." She turned toward the door. "We have a murderer to catch." The Bantry's drawing-room was steeped in silence, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire and the ticking of the grand clock on the mantel. Outside, the village slumbered in uneasy ignorance, unaware that within these walls a drama as old as time itself was reaching its climax. Miss Marple, poised yet unassuming, stood at the centre of the room. Her delicate hands rested lightly on the back of an armchair, her gaze sweeping over the assembled figures. Though her expression remained kind, there was something in her pale blue eyes, a sharpness, an unwavering certainty, that made the occupants of the room shift ever so slightly in their seats. The moment of revelation had arrived. She spoke with the quiet authority of one who had long since pieced together the truth. "We have followed a pattern," she began, "a game played with deadly precision. 2 murders, each mirroring the lines of an old nursery rhyme. Peter Abbott, the King; Iris Henderson, the Queen. A crime of vengeance, rooted in the past." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before continuing. "And now the final act, the knave who fled and was never seen again." A flicker of movement, small, almost imperceptible, drew her attention, a tightening of the jaw, a shift of posture. Not panic, not yet, but recognition. Miss Marple pressed on. "Who among us has been playing this dreadful game?" And though the answer was hidden well, the truth, as it so often does, revealed itself in the smallest of details. She turned her gaze toward Dr. Ellsworth, who had remained unnervingly quiet. "It was you, wasn't it, Doctor?" A gasp. Dr. Ellsworth, who had been reclining in his chair, suddenly stiffened. "Miss Marple," he said with forced composure, "this is a very serious accusation." She nodded gently. "Oh yes, Doctor, very serious indeed." A murmur rippled through the room, but Miss Marple remained composed. She turned to the others. "Dr. Ellsworth came to St. Mary Mead nearly a decade ago. Respectable, well-mannered, trusted. But what few people knew was that his mother was a woman named Sarah Pembroke." A collective intake of breath. Ellsworth's hands curled slightly on the arms of his chair. Miss Marple continued, her voice softer now, almost sympathetic. "You were born in secrecy, sent away with your mother when she was cast out of this village. I imagine you grew up with the knowledge of what had been done to her, of the man who had ruined her life and vanished without consequence. And I imagine that knowledge festered." The doctor exhaled, but said nothing. Miss Marple stepped forward. "For years you waited, and when the moment came when you found yourself back in this village, you saw your chance to rewrite history." She let the words sink in. "You chose Peter Abbott first, because his father was the source of your mother's ruin. Then Iris Henderson, because she had known, and she had remained silent." Dr. Ellsworth's gaze flickered, just for a moment. Miss Marple gave a knowing smile. "But you made a mistake, Doctor. A small one, but significant." Silence. She reached into her handbag and withdrew the slip of paper they had found at the vicarage the night before. "You left a note behind when you fled, Doctor, and in your haste you used the very ink and stationery that can be found in your own medical office." A beat of silence. Then, for the first time, Dr. Ellsworth's carefully composed mask cracked. Dolly Bantry let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Colonel Bantry muttered, "Good Lord." Ellsworth's jaw tensed. For a moment it seemed as though he might protest. But then, as if a great weight had been lifted from him, he simply leaned back in his chair and exhaled. A weary smile, something almost wry, tugged at his lips. "Well," he murmured, I suppose there's no sense in denying it now, is there?" Miss Marple gave a sad little nod. No, there was not. The game was over, and the knave had been caught before he could flee. The drawing-room of the Grange had never held so many secrets at once. The fire burned low, flickering shadows along the mahogany-panelled walls, and the heavy velvet drapes muffled the sounds of the village beyond. Inside, the tension was thick, an unspoken wariness settling over the assembled guests. This was no ordinary gathering. Miss Marple, seated primly in her usual armchair, surveyed the room with an expression of serene composure. Her delicate hands rested lightly on the arms of her chair, her posture that of a woman merely observing, yet the sharpness in her gaze told another story. Around her sat the key players in this deadly game, Dolly Bantry, watching with barely concealed excitement, her fingers twitching against the embroidery on her lap. Colonel Bantry, stiff-backed and impatient, his arms crossed in a soldier's posture of readiness. Dr. Ellsworth, the man at the centre of it all, composed but tense, his eyes darting toward the door, as though already planning an exit. Reverend Milton, pale and grim, his hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. Henry Graves, the village constable, stationed near the fireplace with the wary expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else. Edith Phelps, watching everything with an air of quiet calculation, her lips pursed, her fingers clasped together so tightly they had gone white. No one spoke. Then Miss Marple sighed softly, adjusting the lace cuffs of her sleeves. "Mo," she said at last, her voice gentle but firm, "is never quite as simple as it seems." Dr. Ellsworth exhaled sharply through his nose. "I should think it is quite simple, Miss Marple. The police have their man." She turned to him with a mild smile. "Do they, Doctor?" A flicker of hesitation. She folded her hands in her lap. "2 deaths, both carefully staged. A playing card, a white lily. Symbols chosen with precision, reflecting a nursery rhyme that tells a tale of betrayal and justice." Her voice remained steady, measured. "A crime that is not new, but rather a reenactment of one long past." A hush. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "We all know the rhyme now, Jane, and we all know you found the pattern. The King of Hearts, the one who made the tart. The Queen, the one who wept, and now the knave, the one who must flee. Miss Marple's smile did not move, but his fingers curled slightly over the arm of his chair. Miss Marple's smile did not waver. "Yes, and that is where we find ourselves now, do we not? The murderer, having exacted their revenge, now intends to disappear, just as the rhyme dictates." A shifting in the room. "But," she continued, "one must consider the method, the precision, the patience it must have taken to wait all these years, to plan each step so carefully. Such a crime is not committed in haste." Her eyes locked onto Dr. Ellsworth's. "No," she said softly. "It was written in ink long before it was written in blood." A silence. Dolly Bantry whispered, "But how?" Miss Marple turned toward the others, her tone thoughtful, almost sympathetic. "Dr. Ellsworth has been our trusted physician for years, the very man who pronounced both victims dead. The man who, by his own profession, understands the delicate balance between life and death better than anyone." She leaned forward slightly. "And yet," she said, "he failed to consider one thing." Dr. Ellsworth's jaw tensed. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew a second playing card. One Graves had recovered from Ellsworth's own medical office. "The Jack of Spades," she said quietly. Another hush. Miss Marple turned the card over. Scrawled in ink were the words, "and ne'er was seen again." Miss Marple tilted her head, observing him with something close to pity. "You were planning to stage your own disappearance, weren't you, Doctor? A tragic accident, perhaps? A body found in the river? A body that would never be found at all?" The colour drained from his face. Graves stepped forward instinctively, his fingers grazing his truncheon, but Dr. Ellsworth did not run. Instead, after a long, excruciating pause, he let out a slow breath and leaned back into his chair. "Well," he murmured, "that's rather clever, isn't it?" Miss Marple regarded him gently. "Clever, perhaps, but doomed to fail. You see, Doctor, there is one thing no criminal ever accounts for." He lifted an eyebrow. "And what is that?" Miss Marple smiled. "Human nature." And just like that, the game was over. The knave, for all his cunning, had been caught before he could flee. The silence in the Bantry's drawing-room had become a living thing. Thick, oppressive, coiling around the gathered figures like an unseen spectre. The fire crackled in the hearth, its low, rhythmic popping the only sound in the room as the weight of Miss Marple's quiet accusation settled upon Dr. Ellsworth. For a long moment he did not speak. His fingers traced an absent pattern along the polished arm of his chair. His eyes, which had always carried a certain clinical detachment, now flickered with something else, something dark and uncertain. The room watched him. Miss Marple remained serene, her hands resting lightly in her lap, as if she had merely asked about the weather. But there was steel beneath her composure. She had seen it before, this moment when guilt, when faced with an undeniable truth, began to eat through even the strongest defences. Colonel Bantry, never one for patience, exhaled sharply. "Come now, Doctor, say something, man." Dr. Ellsworth let out a quiet chuckle. "Bitter? Edged with something dangerously close to relief. What would you have me say?" he murmured almost to himself. "That I'm sorry. That I regret what I've done?" Dolly Bantry leaned forward, eyes wide. "Do you?" Ellsworth turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Would it matter if I did?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "It would matter a great deal, Doctor." A pause. Then, at last, he spoke. "Do you know," he said, almost conversationally, "how long I have waited for this?" His gaze swept over the room, lingering on Miss Marple, then drifting to the others. Graves, the Bantriff, Reverend Milton, Edith Phelps. "All of you," he said quietly, "sitting here in this warm, comfortable room, talking of justice, of wrong and right. But none of you were there, were you? None of you saw what was done." Reverend Milton shifted uneasily. "Dr. Ellsworth." "My mother," Ellsworth cut in, his voice cold now, "was destroyed. Do you understand that? She was ruined." A heavy pause. "I grew up with her stories," he continued, his voice lower, filled with quiet fury. "The whispered disgrace, the people who turned their backs, the shame she bore. And all the while Rupert Abbott lived comfortably in London, never answering for what he had done. His family never suffered. Not a single consequence." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet understanding. "And so you waited." Ellsworth let out a breathless laugh. "Yes, Miss Marple, I waited. When I came here, when I became the trusted village doctor, I watched, I listened, and when the time came, I made sure that the sins of the past were finally repaid." His voice grew quieter. "Peter Abbott first. The son of a thief made to answer for his father's crimes. A murmur ran through the room, but no one interrupted. Iris Henderson, he went on, his jaw tightening, because she knew. She knew what had been done, and she said nothing, lived her life in peace, while my mother lived hers in shadows. Miss Marple observed him carefully. And you would have vanished after the third act. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. It was never about me. It was about them. The past demanded justice, and I gave it. A pause, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed. A tired, hollow sound. "Oh, foolish," he murmured. How poetic, I thought. A story played out to its final note. And yet, in the end, here I am. He shook his head. Not nearly as clever as I had imagined. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. Oh, but that is where you are wrong, Doctor. He lifted an eyebrow. She folded her hands in her lap. You were very clever. But cleverness, you see, is not the same as wisdom. And when one builds their world on revenge, one often forgets the simplest truth of all. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. People remember. A silence settled once more. Then, with a quiet, resigned sigh, Dr. Ellsworth leaned back against the chair, and this time he did not protest when Henry Graves stepped forward, resting a heavy hand upon his shoulder. It was over. The nursery rhyme had reached its final verse. The room remained still, the charged silence stretching long after Dr. Ellsworth's final words had faded. The fire flickered in the hearth, its embers glowing faintly, but the warmth did little to dispel the cold weight of realization that had settled over the gathering. Constable Henry Graves, his face set in an expression of grim duty, finally spoke. Well, he said, clearing his throat. I reckon that settles it. Dr. Ellsworth did not resist as Graves stepped forward, producing a pair of handcuffs from his coat pocket. There was no dramatic protest, no frantic attempt to escape. Only the quiet resignation of a man who had long since accepted the consequences of his actions. As Graves secured the cuffs around his wrists, Ellsworth let out a soft, wry chuckle. For years I imagined how this would end, he murmured. But I never thought it would be her who caught me. He lifted his gaze toward Miss Marple, who sat primly in her chair, as composed as ever. She gave him a small, sad smile. Murder, my dear doctor, is a most untidy thing. It has a way of unravelling no matter how carefully one weaves it. Dolly Bantry, who had been watching the proceedings with wide eyes, exhaled sharply. Well, I must say, I never imagined it was him, she whispered to her husband. All these years tending to people's ailments, and yet all the while Colonel Bantry gave a small grunt. Bit of a shock, but I rather think Jane had it worked out days ago. Miss Marple simply gave a modest smile. Dr. Ellsworth glanced at her again, his expression unreadable. Tell me, Miss Marple, he said, his voice quieter now, if I had been just a little less careful, left out the playing card, perhaps, or the lily, you think I might have gotten away with it? Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, considering the question. For a time, perhaps, she conceded, but murder, Doctor, is not so easily forgotten as one might wish. You see, people, particularly in villages, remember things. Small things. An overheard remark, a misplaced object, a look exchanged at the wrong moment, and eventually those little things add up. She folded her hands in her lap. You may have followed your nursery rhyme to its end, but you see, a nursery rhyme is only a story, and stories do not account for real people. Real people have a way of interfering. Ellsworth let out a breathless laugh. Indeed they do. Constable Graves gave him a firm nudge toward the door. "Come along, then." As the doctor was led away, the tension in the room eased slightly, though it left behind an odd, lingering weight. The game was over, and yet the knowledge that such a crime had taken root in St. Mary Mead, carefully, deliberately, was not easily shaken. Reverend Milton sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "It is a terrible thing," he murmured. "How long grief and resentment can fester, that a crime so old could still cause death after all these years." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Yes, Reverend, it is a terrible thing indeed. The past does not always stay buried, especially when there is someone determined to dig it up." Dolly Bantry leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Do you really think he regretted it, Jane?" Miss Marple sighed softly. "Perhaps in the end. But regret is a curious thing, Dolly. Some feel it before they act, others only after they have been caught." Dolly shivered slightly. "A rather chilling thought." Miss Marple smiled, but there was something wistful in her expression. "Yes, dear, but then again, murder is a most chilling thing." She reached for her knitting, pulling it neatly onto her lap. The village clock outside struck the hour, its chime carrying through the quiet air. Life in St. Mary Mead would return to normal, as it always did. Tea would be poured, gardens tended, gossip exchanged. But beneath it all, the village had changed, if only a little, because even in the quietest of places, the past is never truly past. The air in St. Mary Mead had changed. It was not something tangible, nor something that could be observed outright. The hedgerows remained neatly trimmed, the postman still made his daily rounds, and the morning mist still clung stubbornly to the rooftops before burning away beneath the pale autumn sun. But beneath the surface of the village's gentle rhythms there was an unspoken understanding. Something dark had passed through, and though it had been caught and caged, it had left a mark. The talk had not ceased, of course. It never did. At the Bluebell tea-room, Mrs. Bartlett and Miss Hartnell exchanged whispered theories over cups of weak Earl Grey, speculating whether Dr. Ellsworth had ever truly planned to flee, or whether Miss Marple had simply outmanoeuvred him before he could make up his mind. At the greengrocer's, young Nancy had been heard remarking that she always found the doctor a bit too quiet, and that one ought to be wary of a man who never takes sugar in his tea. And at the Grange, Colonel and Dolly Bantry sat in their drawing-room, watching the fire flicker in the hearth, discussing the matter with a gravity they rarely reserved for anything outside of estate affairs. Dolly Bantry, curled up in a chintz armchair, turned to her husband with a sigh. "It's a peculiar thing, Arthur, to think we've lived alongside him all these years, and yet none of us ever suspected a thing." Colonel Bantry, settled in his usual chair with a copy of the Times folded across his lap, grunted. "Well, of course we didn't suspect him, Dolly. He was the doctor. People trust doctors, same as vicars and policemen. No one ever thinks to question them." He shook his head. "Damn clever of Miss Marple, though, I'll give her that." Dolly hummed in agreement, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "Does make one think, though, about secrets." Arthur glanced at her over the top of his paper. "What about them?" Dolly frowned. "How they never really go away, I suppose. Everyone in the village had all but forgotten about Sarah Pembroke and Rupert Abbott, hadn't they? But it didn't matter in the end. The past caught up, whether we remembered it or not." Arthur exhaled, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Suppose that's true enough." Dolly hesitated before continuing, her voice quieter now. "Do you think it was justice, Arthur?" Her husband looked at her, surprised. "What?" She lifted her gaze to his, her expression unusually serious. What Dr. Ellsworth did, do you think it was justice? Or just revenge dressed up as something righteous?" Arthur was silent for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, he set his newspaper aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Justice is a fine thing in theory, Dolly, but in practice, well, it's not as neat as one would like." He reached for his whiskey glass and swirled the amber liquid. "Murder's still murder, no matter what cause a man thinks he's serving." Dolly nodded slowly. "Yes," she murmured. "I suppose that's the bitter part of justice, isn't it? It never quite feels as good as one hopes it will." Arthur said nothing, only took a slow sip of his drink. Outside, the village continued its slow return to normalcy. The butcher's boy whistled as he made his deliveries. A pair of children played a game of marbles in the street, their laughter bright and unburdened. And at the vicarage, Reverend Milton prepared his Sunday sermon, one that would, no doubt, speak gently of redemption, of the long reach of the past, and of the fragile, hopeful thing that was forgiveness. For life in St. Mary Mead would go on, as it always did, but some wounds, even in the quietest of villages, never truly fade. The quiet hum of the village had returned. Miss Marple sat by the fire in her small, tidy sitting-room, the flames casting a warm glow across the delicate lace doilies and well-worn books that lined the shelves. Outside, the familiar sounds of St. Mary Mead drifted in, the distant clatter of a milk cart, the murmured voices of neighbours exchanging pleasantries, the occasional bark of a dog. Life, as it always did, had resumed its usual rhythm. She reached for her knitting, her fingers moving automatically as she stared into the fire. The case, the murders, the revelations, the slow unravelling of secrets was now behind her. And yet, as always, it lingered in her mind, weaving itself into the broader tapestry of human nature that she had spent a lifetime observing. She had never been one for melodrama. Murder, despite its often dramatic presentation, was rarely about the grand passions that filled the pages of novels. No, it was something much simpler, much more human. Greed, resentment, fear, love, misplaced, denied or betrayed. Dr. Ellsworth's crime had not been one of sudden rage, nor one of reckless ambition. It had been slow and patient, built upon years of quiet anger, fed by the echoes of a past he could never escape. Miss Marple let out a small sigh, setting down her knitting. The past was a curious thing. One could ignore it, bury it, pretend it had no consequence. But sooner or later it had a way of pushing to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. She had seen it before, time and again. The careful respectability of a village did little to obscure the truths that lay beneath its surface. People lived their lives in small, seemingly inconsequential ways, never realizing how each decision, each moment, was merely a stitch in a greater pattern. And yet it was always the smallest details that unravelled the greatest secrets. A misplaced card, a forgotten nursery rhyme, a hesitation in a voice, a flicker of emotion too quickly masked. She smiled to herself. The truth in the end was never truly hidden. It only required the right eyes to see it. Reaching for her cup of tea, she took a careful sip before settling back into her chair. The fire crackled, the clock ticked softly, and the village beyond carried on, blissfully unaware of the musings of an elderly woman with a sharp mind and a quiet understanding of the world. The case was closed. But human nature, that was a mystery that would never end. The morning light fell softly over St. Mary Mead, washing the village in pale gold as mist curled lazily above the hedgerows. It was a morning like any other, or at least that was how it seemed on the surface. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bartlett was already engaged in a lively discussion with Miss Hartnell, their conversation punctuated by nods, dramatic pauses, and the occasional scandalized gasp. One could hardly expect the events of the past weeks to fade overnight. Near the churchyard, Reverend Milton stood quietly, speaking with a few parishioners who had gathered to tidy the flower-beds. His sermon that Sunday had been a thoughtful one, on redemption, on the long reach of past deeds, and on the power of truth, even when painful. At the Bluebell tea-room, young Nancy, bright-eyed and eager, carried a tray of fresh scones to a table where Dolly Bantry sat with Edith Phelps, the two women engaged in what could only be described as a most serious examination of village affairs. But beneath the gossip and speculation, something had shifted. There was no denying that St. Mary Mead had been changed, if only slightly. The shadow of murder, once draped over its picturesque cottages and quiet lanes, was beginning to lift. The village, resilient as ever, was returning to itself, its rhythms, its whispers, its small but essential joys. And in the middle of it all, in her neat and modest cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she watched the world outside. She had seen it all before, of course. The way a village absorbed tragedy, turned it over like soil in the garden and carried on. The way people moved forward, some with quiet relief, others with a kind of determined energy that only the avoidance of darker thoughts could inspire. She understood it, and in her own way she admired it. For life in St. Mary Mead would always contain its little secrets, the carefully kept pasts, the minor deceptions, the half-truths buried beneath polite smiles, the illusion of simplicity that masked the tangled web beneath. And that, Miss Marple thought with a small, knowing smile, was what made it such a very interesting place to live. With a quiet sigh, she picked up her cup of tea and took a sip. The morning was peaceful, for now, but mysteries, like seasons, had a way of returning, and in St. Mary Mead life, ever full of intrigue, would go on.